46 years ago today, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. All 29 crew members aboard died. It was the largest ship to ever sink in the Great Lakes. Resting place is now 530 feet below the lake's surface.
Imagine this. An underwater drone sinks 530 feet into the black waters of Lake Superior. Its lights cut through a graveyard silence, and suddenly the legendary SS Edmund Fitzgerald emerges from the shadows.
One of Michigan's most well-known shipwrecks. People still love talking about the Edmund Fitzgerald and the unanswered questions behind its sinking, so we took a closer look.
For 50 years, people thought this ship went down because of a storm. But what experts saw on those drone feeds was something far more terrifying. A discovery that rewrites the entire tragedy and exposes a level of corporate negligence nobody wanted to admit. And what they found proves the tragedy wasn't just bad weather. It was something far more sinister: the slow-motion corporate disaster. The truth about what really killed the Edmund Fitzgerald's 29 crew members didn't start with a single storm. It was building for years, like a slow-motion corporate disaster that everyone in charge saw coming and chose to ignore. Take Captain Ernest McSorley, the man at the helm. In 1975 alone, he sailed the Fitzgerald through 4 different monster storms on Lake Superior. Each one could have been the ship's last, but McSorley wasn't reckless. He was following company expectations: keep the iron ore moving no matter the cost. That pressure from above created a culture where cutting corners became routine. And the Fitzgerald was already a ticking time bomb. Engineers had long documented something they called the loose keel. In rough weather, the ship didn't just sway. It flexed so badly sailors said it moved like a dancer's hips. Imagine a 730-foot iron freighter literally bending under stress. Over time, that kind of motion weakens steel and puts tremendous strain on welds and rivets. Now, in theory, regular maintenance should have kept the Fitzgerald safe. But the company running her had different priorities. They rolled out what was basically a deferred maintenance program, which sounds harmless until you realize what it meant. Profits first, safety second. Repairs that should have been made immediately were pushed off to save time and money. It was a strategy that looked good on paper until you considered the human cost. 29 men depending on a ship that was slowly being hollowed out from within. And then came the most damning corporate decision of all. The Fitzgerald's load line, the legal mark that shows how deep a ship can safely sit in the water, was raised by 3 feet and 3¼ inches. That may not sound like much, but it meant the Fitzgerald carried heavier loads while sitting lower in the water, dangerously close to the waves that could wash across her deck. Experts now believe this single decision drastically increased the ship's vulnerability to flooding. In other words, the Fitzgerald's fate was being sealed long before her final voyage. These problems weren't isolated mistakes. They were part of a pattern. Radar issues plagued the ship, making it harder to navigate in poor visibility. The hatch covers, which were supposed to keep water out of the cargo hold, were known to be unreliable. And the structure itself, the very bones of the vessel, wasn't as strong as it should have been. Every corner cut, every repair delayed, and every dangerous voyage ordered by the company created a chain reaction that led straight to disaster. When you look at the timeline, the tragedy stops feeling like an accident and starts looking like inevitability. By the fall of 1975, the Fitzgerald wasn't just another freighter on the Great Lakes. She was a symbol of corporate negligence pushed to its breaking point. And the crew, 29 men who trusted their ship, were left to carry the risk. So, when experts flew that underwater drone toward the wreck nearly 50 years later, they weren't just searching for answers. They were staring straight at the consequences of years of ignored warnings and corporate decisions that gambled with human lives. And what the drone revealed on the bottom of Lake Superior makes it clear: this wasn't just about bad weather. The Edmund Fitzgerald was already broken before the storm ever hit, but the most shocking discovery was still waiting 530 feet below on Lake Superior's bottom: the smoking gun evidence. Experts fly an underwater drone towards the wreck of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. The lights sweep across her twisted hull 530 feet down, and suddenly the cameras catch something that no one expected to see. It wasn't mangled steel or torn metal from the storm. It was neat, undisturbed, almost too perfect. 14 hatch cover clamps lined up in a row, all of them intact, all of them unbroken, and every single one frozen in the open position. That's the smoking gun. For decades, people argued the storm ripped the hatches open, or maybe shifting iron ore cargo snapped them loose. But the footage shows otherwise. These clamps weren't torn off in chaos. They were never secured properly in the first place. 14 in a row, unbroken, just sitting there. If you wanted evidence that the Fitzgerald wasn't sealed for battle against Lake Superior that night, this is it. Think about what that means. The Fitzgerald wasn't destroyed by some freak wave. She was carrying an impossible load into a November gale with her defenses already down. The hatch covers, which should have kept thousands of gallons of water out, were essentially unlocked. It's like flying into a hurricane with the cockpit door wide open. And the evidence doesn't stop there. The drone revealed torn vent covers lying exactly where Captain McSorley reported damage over the radio at 3:30 p.m. He had said they were taking heavy seas and suspected topside damage. The wreck confirmed it decades later. Those vents were ripped clean, and once they were gone, water had a clear path into the cargo hold. Now, if the hatch clamps were unsecured and the vents were open to the storm, the question becomes, how much water could the Fitzgerald actually take on? Coast Guard engineers calculated it back in the 1970s. With unsecured hatches, she could have been flooding at a rate of 4,000 gallons per minute. That's like emptying an Olympic swimming pool into the ship every 15 minutes. And in the black water of Superior, that kind of flooding doesn't just make you heavy. It makes you slow, sluggish, and unable to recover from the next monster wave. The crazy part is that this aligns almost perfectly with the Coast Guard's original 1977 report. At the time, their conclusion was that unsecured hatches caused the sinking. But the families, the company, and even rival experts pushed back. They said no, the clamps must have ripped off under stress. It took nearly 50 years and the silent eye of an underwater robot to prove the Coast Guard was right all along. The clamps weren't ripped. They were waiting, untouched, in the open position, like a forgotten switch that sealed the ship's fate. And here's where it gets even darker. The Fitzgerald wasn't just unlucky with her hatches. She was built with a flaw baked in from day one. The welding technique used along her seams was something called scalloped welding. Instead of smooth, continuous welds, it left tiny gaps between sections of steel. Those gaps were weak points, almost like dotted lines in the hull. In calm weather, you'd never notice. But in the violent heave of Superior's November storms, those weak points could flex and crack under pressure, letting water in where no one could see. The Fitzgerald was advertised as an unstoppable ore carrier, but structurally, she was riddled with vulnerabilities. So picture this sequence as the drone shows it to us. The Fitzgerald sails into the storm with her load line already pushed dangerously low. Waves hammer the deck, vents rip away, and water pours into the hold. The hatch clamps, never locked, let in thousands more gallons. The scalloped welds, already strained from years of flexing, buckle under the pressure. And the weight builds minute by minute until the ship can no longer rise against the waves. It's not one catastrophic failure. It's every shortcut, every compromise, every unchecked box on a safety form coming together at once. That's why the drone footage feels like watching detective work unfold in real time. Each clue, the clamps, the vents, the welds, lines up perfectly with reports, suspicions, and warnings that had been dismissed for years. It's the kind of confirmation that turns theory into truth. And it's terrifying because it proves the disaster was avoidable. The Fitzgerald didn't need a freak wave to sink. She was already defeated before the storm even arrived. And yet, even with all of this physical evidence, the most haunting discovery wasn't steel or clamps or welds. The most haunting discovery waiting on the lakebed was human. Evidence that at least one crew member knew in their final moments, that they were going to die the preserved crew member. And then comes the discovery that shook everyone to their core. In the summer of 1994, diver Fred Shannon sent a remote camera gliding along the wreck's bow. Experts fly an underwater drone towards the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. What they see is terrifying, but not for the reason anyone expected. Out of the shadows, caught in the pale lights, was a human figure. A crew member, preserved in place for almost 20 years. He was lying near the bow, still wearing coveralls and strapped into a cork life jacket. Think about that. This wasn't someone caught off guard in their bunk. This was a man who knew. He had time to put on his gear, to grab what little protection he could, and to try to escape. That life jacket was his last act of survival, proof that at least one member of the Fitzgerald's crew fought to get out. And here's the chilling part. Lake Superior's waters sit at 34 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Cold enough to preserve. Cold enough to hold this sailor's body in haunting stillness for 2 full decades. In that temperature, nature becomes an archive. Instead of decay, there was preservation, as if the lake itself wanted to keep the truth visible for anyone brave enough to look. But it wasn't just the body that told a story. Investigators noted open doors on the wreck, doors that should have been sealed tight. That suggests crew members were moving fast in those final minutes, scrambling to escape, desperately trying to reach the deck or the lifeboats. The theory that Fitzgerald went down instantly, swallowed in seconds, doesn't hold up when you see the evidence. These men had a warning. They knew they were in mortal danger, and they tried to survive. And this is where the human tragedy collides head-on with corporate negligence. The ship was sent out with hatch clamps, unsecured, scalloped welds that weakened her frame, and a load line that pushed her too low in the water. The crew didn't stand a chance, but they didn't go quietly. They fought. They tried. And Superior still carries their final attempt, etched into the wreck itself. Of course, the discovery sparked an immediate storm. Shannon's footage wasn't just technical data. It showed the face of loss. A reminder that these weren't just numbers on a Coast Guard report, but fathers, sons, and brothers. Families of the 29 men were furious when they learnt divers had photographed remains without permission. Some felt it was desecration, others said it was necessary proof. Either way, the pain was reopened. Grief that had settled into silence after almost 2 decades came rushing back to the surface. But for historians and experts, that body near the bow was undeniable. It proved beyond doubt that the crew had time to act. It proved they knew their ship was failing around them. And it proved that the Fitzgerald's final chapter wasn't instant or painless. It was desperate, human, and terrifying. And the wreck itself tells an even more haunting story. What those final moments were really like, locked inside a steel giant that was breaking apart beneath them. The wreck tells its story. And if that preserved crew member was haunting, the wreck itself is even more terrifying. When experts fly an underwater drone towards the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, what they see is not just a broken ship. It is a crime scene frozen in steel. The twisted metal tells the story of her final, desperate moments. The bow is the first thing the cameras reveal. It sits eerily upright, stabbed deep into the muddy lakebed, as if the ship tried to stand against the weight of the storm one last time. You can see the forward hull driven straight into the clay, the pilot house and deck house still attached, though the damage is staggering. What really rattles experts is the state of the pilot house itself. This was above the waterline when the ship went down, yet the steel is buckled, crushed, and deformed. That kind of collapse could only have happened if the Fitzgerald split and twisted apart at the surface before she even slipped below. Then the cameras push further. Almost 6 football fields away from the bow, the stern is found, completely inverted, upside down, ripped clean from the rest of the vessel. It's as if a giant hand tore the Fitzgerald in two, flung her pieces apart, and then left them to sink separately into the dark. The distance between the sections isn't just disturbing. It's damning evidence that the ship didn't slide down intact. She was ripped apart above the water, scattering her remains like shrapnel. And the proof is everywhere. Scattered across the lakebed are thousands of taconite pellets, the very iron ore she carried. They're not contained in the hull, they're split across the debris field. That cargo was dumped violently into the water as the ship split open, which means this wasn't a slow, graceful sinking. The Fitzgerald came apart catastrophically on the surface. The lifeboats drive the point home. Investigators found them crushed, ripped apart, and twisted into useless wreckage. And these weren't toy rafts. They were steel lifeboats built to withstand tough conditions. Their state proved beyond doubt that nobody ever made it to safety. Men may have tried. They may have rushed for the boats in those final frantic minutes, but the Fitzgerald was tearing herself apart under them. There was no escape. The entire wreck site, from the bow stabbed into the clay to the inverted stern and the torn lifeboats, stretches across hundreds of feet of lakebed. It is chaos, frozen in place. To divers and historians, it is the most convincing evidence yet of catastrophic structural failure. And that is where the horror shifts from nature to negligence. Because this breakup didn't happen out of nowhere. The Fitzgerald was weakened long before that storm. Her hatch clamps weren't properly secured. Her load line had been pushed lower and lower over the years to cram in more cargo. And most damning of all were the scalloped welds. Instead of continuous, solid welds, the Fitzgerald's hull seams were stitched in patterns that left vulnerable fracture points. Those scallops were supposed to save money and speed up construction. But in practice, they created weak spots across the Fitzgerald's spine. When the stress of heavy seas and overloading met those fracture lines, the ship didn't bend. She broke. So when experts fly those underwater drones and see the Fitzgerald in pieces, they're not just seeing the aftermath of a storm. They're looking at a steel giant whose back snapped under decades of corporate corner cutting. The twisted wreck is a silent testimony that this wasn't just an accident. It was the predictable result of a system that put profit above safety, and men paid for that decision with their lives. And here's the most infuriating part. This tragedy didn't have to happen. The Fitzgerald could have been saved, and the 29 men on board could have come home. So, let's talk about exactly how it could have been prevented. The preventable tragedy. What the drones showed was terrifying, but the real horror is that this didn't have to happen. The breakup of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was not an unpredictable act of nature. It was a predictable tragedy, built decision by decision. The evidence is clear. The ship's load line had been lowered again and again, forcing her to ride lower in the water so she could carry more ore. That made her more profitable, but it also left her dangerously exposed in heavy seas. Her hatch clamps had a long history of issues that were quietly patched instead of permanently fixed. Even her very skeleton, the welded seams of her steel hull, had been compromised by cost-cutting scalloped welds that created weak fracture points. So, when that storm hit, the Fitzgerald wasn't fighting with full strength. She was already weakened and pushed past her safe limits, and when the waves piled on, her back finally snapped. Experts who studied the wreck say the story the drones revealed was not one of mystery, but one of corporate neglect. The Fitzgerald was pushed too hard, with too little care, for too long. It was corporate manslaughter dressed up as bad weather, and the cost was 29 men. Sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. Men who dreamed of safe voyages and of coming home. Their lives were cut short because profit was put ahead of protection. After the wreck, maritime regulations were changed. Stronger hatch covers, stricter inspections, and safer load limits became mandatory. The lessons were written in blood. And in 1995, when the ship's bell was raised and rung 29 times, once for each life lost, it became their memorial at Whitefish Point. So, when experts flew that underwater drone and saw the Fitzgerald torn apart, they weren't just looking at twisted steel. They were looking at the price of corporate greed. Remember their names. Learn from their tragedy. Never let profits claim more lives. The wreck still lies silent under Superior's black waters, a steel warning ignored until it was too late. But if Prophet could sink one unsinkable giant, how many others are just waiting? And when the next storm comes, will we recognize the signs or repeat the same mistakes?